Welcome to Fantastic Females, our adventure to finding the mythical island of freedom together. I'm Kalyani.
And I'm Rupali. We are your next door finance experts sharing our experiences in the world of money and energetics.
Hello and welcome to episode 6. We'll be talking about inflation today. It's become such a hot topic and we're so excited to bring this up. We had to leave our leanings about going in a particular order, and we want to bring more relevant topics to this podcast so it makes more sense to you and you can use this information more freely.
I think the importance of bringing it up at this stage is there's never been a time where the word inflation has been used this many times over various different platforms, be it social media, be it your news channels, be it your online news websites. And so we'd love to kind of share our thoughts on it and what that means for you.
Exactly. I remember talking a lot about it during university days, and I remember photos from I think the Second World War and 1970s and Bolivia and Zimbabwe coming up as examples when there was hyperinflation and things went out of hand to the point that currency was being used as toilet paper. And from the university time until now, I don't think I've heard the term inflation used as much as it has been in the last 6 months. So we're here to unpack all of it, and let's get right into it. What is inflation, Rupali? Let's start with that.
So basically, in very, very simple terms, inflation measures how prices go up, prices that you pay for your goods and services in a very broad sense.
Exactly. And each one of us notices this around us. It may only be the terminology that you may have not heard of before, or that you might be switching your mind off to sometimes if it sounds foreign or unfamiliar, overwhelming even. To put it in simple terms, we've all seen that the same candy that we had when we were kids, when you try and buy it for your kids, it always costs more. We remember our grandparents giving us examples of, back in our times, this used to cost only 5 pence, whereas our kids haven't even seen 5 pence coins now, so on and so forth. A very recent example around us in the UAE would be inflation in the gas prices. For my car, I remember paying 185 dirhams back in April of this year, and now I routinely end up paying 300 to the tune of 300, 320. So it does pinch the pocket, and we all feel it. But we'll be talking about whether this is good, bad, and how you can combat this today.
Exactly. I think when you're in a certain mindset, then you tend to take everything in a certain way. So today, for example, the news is really highlighting inflation to be this villain in the story of our lives. But actually, we're here to shed some light in terms of different perspectives on how you can think of it.
Yeah, let's start with Rupali, if you can share your perspective on what are generally the ideal levels and where we are at right now. Why is there such a hue and cry about the present situation?
Sure. So typically speaking, I mean, everything is always subjective, but what we've been seeing and taught is that ideal levels of inflation are about 2 to 3%. That is in a healthy economy. That's not kind of where it's not ramping up too quickly or slowing down too quickly. On average, 2 to 3% is a good level.
And you just had a very interesting fact to share with me with economies that pass the 5% mark.
Yeah, so for developed economies that pass the 5% inflation mark, it actually usually takes around 10 years on average to go back to your 2% mark. So if you take the latest inflation figure for August, which was just released a couple of weeks ago, it was 8.3%. And so that gives you an idea of where we are and how long inflation may stay.
Yeah, and also to give you a little more context, the 8.3% is the latest figure. Before that, for July, the figure was 8.5%. For June, it was 9.1%. For May, it was 8.6%. April 8.3%, March 8.5%, so on and so forth. For the entire year of 2022, it's been above 7%. So this has been a long lasting discussion for this reason, because even 7% is an alarming number. We were close to 5% last September of 2021 is the last time I see a figure of 5.4%, which is also pushing the comfort levels of economists, obviously, in the US economy. The US economy, a lot of the times, ends up being almost a representative of the world economy. So that's one thing to remember. And in this globalized world, we've seen the Bank of Iceland collapsing and having a massive impact on the global markets. The global markets kind of got triggered back in 2008 when there was a crash, and the trigger point, the tip of the iceberg, so to say, was the collapse of the Bank of Iceland. So this is why this is such a big discussion, and hopefully that makes more sense to you now.
Just to put some perspective into these numbers, when we say 8.3, 8.5%, whatever it is, then that's like a year-on-year number. So it's a comparison between August end this year, 2022, versus August end last year, 2021. And everything that you look at has to be kind of taken into perspective. So, for example, if August end last year was historically low, then this year's August end number may look artificially high in terms of percentage. And so everything has a base effect, especially with COVID and the crisis. We will explain a little bit more about what has driven inflation, what's caused the drop and the rise. But the base effect plays such a huge role, and everywhere, all stats that are coming out about the global economy are either at historic highs or lows. There's nothing to panic about that. It's a part of life. We've had 10, 20 years where inflation levels have remained low, and so a lot of us through our lifetimes have never seen these numbers, so we don't know what to do with this information, and that's also why the hype. The second reason why there's a hype is the world is much more connected now. So social media, people love kind of beating the drum about something to get attention. So, whether it's news channels, whether it's everyone is biased in their own mindset regarding at what point in lives they are for themselves, and that kind of drives the tone of what they're delivering to you. And so what we really need to be careful of is where we get our information, what drives our thought process around inflation and the economy, and what we'd like to do with it going forward. And this is where our mindset plays a big role.
Exactly. And also to add to this, when the inflation numbers come out, the agency that brings them out is called CPI. And I don't want to go into details of how this is calculated, but it would suffice for everyone to understand that they take a representative set of products from the economy, from a typical consumer's behavior, shopping behavior. And this typical consumer may consume, let's say, beef and eggs and a certain amount of fuel and milk, for example. But for me as Kalyani, I may not be consuming so much beef, but I may be consuming organic kale, for example, just giving random examples here. And if the typical consumer faces an 8% inflation, then for Kalyani, the inflation could sometimes be 10%, 12% for the set of products that she chooses to use or she's habitual to using. So it becomes subjective in the sense of how each of us is feeling this inflation as well. If there's someone who's doing a daily commute from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, they'll feel the inflation in fuel prices a lot more than someone who just goes from Marina to Media City, for example. And this again brings us to the point of, we've mentioned this before, of just having your cash sitting in the banks or putting them in fixed deposits that are now coming up to match the interest rate increase. But even then, they stay below 3%. And if we're talking about inflation CPI numbers being close to 8-9%, and the real inflation that we feel, it's a bit like the weather indicator when the temperature shows as 30 degrees, but the real feel is 45 degrees. It happens often to us in the GCC. It's a bit like that. So if the CPI numbers are coming out as 8%, 9%, you may feel it as 12%, sometimes even 15%. And that's why it's very important to understand what tools you have and how you should make your money work for yourselves to beat this inflation.
So with that in mind, Kalyani, let's maybe go through why prices are going up. Why is it at 8%? And, what's driving this?
There's so much to unpack once again, but we'll try and keep it as easy as possible. I would like to start with the simple fact of every economy needs a cycle. I think everything in life needs a cycle, right? As above, so below. And this is just where the natural balance of things comes up, and economies reflect the same. These ups and downs in an economy are healthy and necessary. Otherwise, it would be a very unnatural, linear, straight line that would represent growth. Too much of growth is not sustainable as well. Then we would become an elephant in a porcelain store. Like, we would not be able to have any time to consolidate our strengths or to consider minorities, for example, and have a more inclusive growth. So a slower growth, a more thoughtful, mindful growth is healthy and necessary.
Drawing a parallel to our personal lives actually is that, sometimes you do need that downtime or that slow time to kind of, like Kalyani said, consolidate, maybe think about what it is that's going on, how to be more efficient. Similarly with corporates, when there is a down market, then corporates are forced to really optimize and make things a lot more efficient and come out a lot more stronger. So while positive growth and lots of salary hikes and all of that is excellent. I mean, look, we're all waiting for that, aren't we? But the down market is really important for this reason, to bring in the balance.
Yeah, and why the prices increase can simply be explained by the forces of demand and supply. I think I can talk about this for an hour, so maybe Rupali, you can try and say it in brief.
Sure. So supply and demand. Demand is the consumer and us as consumers, and everyone is a consumer ultimately. Even corporates are consumers. So supply is basically the supply of goods. So to draw a very basic parallel to our daily lives, if you go to your local store, they've got a lot of stock of biscuit, for example. Not enough people are buying. That means the supply of that biscuit in that store is high and the demand is low. To bring the balance back, what the store may decide to do is have like a 50% sale to increase the demand so people are more enticed to buy it. A similar parallel is your Uber drives when there are access drivers in the market, but not enough people using the Uber car, and so prices may reflect that. But we more often see it on the opposite end of the spectrum when there are not enough cars, but there's too much demand, and so prices reflect that by increasing prices.
So they have the surge pricing, I think, right?
Surge pricing, right. So with supply and demand, basically it's a very simple equation. To entice you to buy something that's in oversupply, prices will go down. If we have an undersupply, so less of the same good, then stores get away with charging a premium.
Exactly. So anything in economics is a tug of war, basically, between the forces of demand and supply, and equilibrium, philosophically or figuratively, is found when these two forces are in balance. At the moment, what we're seeing is a combination of high demand, and we'll cover why that is, while there is a low supply. This is a lethal combination for the prices to go up. Shall I start with why there's a high demand, Rupali?
Yeah, go for it.
So we saw that in 2020, when there was this completely unexpected pandemic that came over all of us, in March 2020, there was a sharp decline in the stock market, just taking the stock market as a reflection of the economy and the sentiment around us right now. So in March 2020, like we've seen, there was a big crash in the stock market, and there was panic about what's going to happen, whether the world's going to carry on in the same way as we've known for it to be. And to combat this sentiment, pretty much, and to keep the economy going at whatever normal pace there could be despite the lockdowns, etc., the governments decided to aid this by pumping printed cash into the economy. This was done through various ways. One of them was direct payouts, which is quite unique way of dealing with this situation. We haven't seen this previously in our lifetimes, but this was done commonly in the Western economies to give a support to people who are not able to go out in the market and earn their living. And secondly, this was done by reducing interest rates, making borrowing really easy, which is why a lot of people around yourselves, or even you, may have decided to buy a house or cars during this time while the loans were really cheap. When this happens, the direct effect of this is there's more cash in the hands of consumers. When there's more cash in the hands of consumers, they want to buy more products. So while there has been this looming pandemic over us, the cash payouts, the increased supply of cash in the economy has meant that there is still a continuous demand in the economy, which is quite encouraging for producers. So the producers and the demand have kind of been growing while we've had this looming danger upon us.
So, with the support that the governments have provided, that's what we call monetary support. And there's also an element of fiscal support. But the point is that the government was supporting corporates to be able to afford their employees, to not let go of them. The government was supporting employees and the consumer by filling their pockets with money. We all knew that's not going to be sustainable. The government cannot be printing money and keeping interest rates as low for as long. And so the result of that has been that, one, the economy was able to kind of ramp up quickly. So drawing again the parallel to the stock market, stock markets dipped in March 2020, but then, shot up quite quickly. And in the history of the stock market, there have been very few to no instances like this where, a crisis kind of gets resolved just at the snap of a finger like that.
Exactly. And Rupali mentioned monetary policy. The alternative to this is fiscal policy. And usually that comes about as more infrastructure spending, more government spending to increase employment. But we need to consider economies and governments as large cruise ships, as an example. And when you want a cruise ship, a big steamer, to turn its direction, it takes a long time and a large kind of peripheral circle to come back in the direction that you want it to go. So fiscal policy would have been a much longer, much more kind of long-winded way to deal with this problem, and the governments decided against it. When we mention the governments, it does end up being the US government leading this. Like I said, it ends up being the representative of the global economy. And that's what happened, and we were expecting a correction to come up, and it's what's happening right now.
To add to this, the geopolitical issue that's been there since March 2022 between Russia and Ukraine has really impacted the economy in ways that was never expected. So while the economy and the global, just the world was recovering from the COVID shock, figuring out our way through a pandemic that not many have experienced, to now landing up with this Russia-Ukraine war, which has resulted in oil gases prices going up, food and commodities like wheat have shot up due to the production of these kind of commodities in Russia and Ukraine. And given that these prices have been going up, we've directly felt the impact, as Kalyani mentioned, on our pockets through fuel prices.
Yeah, so whereas the increased cash supply led to a higher demand, something like this has led to a drop in supply, because fuel prices just sounds as one aspect, but it leads to inflation all across, because in this globalized world, a lot of our raw materials are imported, exported, and when fuel prices go up, that means transportation of everything goes up, that means deliveries are more expensive, and you can understand what a wide impact that has on cost of production. So we've hopefully understood demand going up while supply has had to go down or had to become more expensive. these are kind of the two factors that we already had. And to add to this, I would briefly like to mention that pre-COVID, the world kind of gave free rein to China to become its factory. So China became the factory of the world, and such severe dependence on one country was anyway being flagged as being dangerous, but the cost impact was so high versus producing anywhere else that the companies chose to ignore it at the point. With COVID, we found that China had possibly for the better, they had a strict lockdown policy, and the severe lockdowns meant that the factories were not able to be manned and they were not producing items. This has also led to massive shortfall in supply. There are various little nitty-gritties in this that we would probably like to avoid for now. If you're interested, please leave a comment on our social media and we'll do a separate episode on that.
The big impact of this China lockdown is, something that we're all heavily dependent on. I mean, the computers we're using today, the phones we're using today, most of our electronics have these little chips, and they're called the semiconductor chips. And so you may have come across the semiconductor crisis for over the past few months, and actually even since last year, which has further kind of put strain on the markets on the supply side. And due to the lockdowns in China, there was not enough produced. Also, companies kind of slowed down production because they were not sure what the demand will be like, because as we explained, an oversupply can be an issue in terms of prices and what that means. So in order to get that balance right, there was also a slowdown in production, but then the lockdown stopped production, and that's what resulted in the semiconductor crisis. I mean, semiconductor chips are used also in things like AI, machine learning, phones. There's a lot to it. Cars, almost every electronic item we're exposed to has some form of a chip which drives it. And so that was just to shed some light on what the semiconductor crisis has been.
Yeah, semiconductors kind of drew me in for some interesting research. And as the entrepreneur at heart that I am, I started looking into why it's so hard to make these, and maybe it's a business to consider, if not for myself, the richest kind of people around. Why is it such a big problem that no one's been able to resolve it, and we still carry on talking about it a year or more after the shortage started? And what I've learned in brief is that semiconductors were produced by two companies, AMC and Intel, and they're very specialized chips, and they're based on a form of architecture that has been optimized for all these devices that we use them on, from phones to cars. And it's not very easy for a new entrant to now enter the market and start producing them. While we see Google, Apple, Tesla all entering and wanting to make their own semiconductor chips to reduce their dependence on China and the companies that they were first buying from. So these are all the changes that are coming out of this shortage that we've seen. Today we've understood what is inflation, what is meant by these numbers that we see as 8%, 9% in the news, how these numbers actually end up affecting us, what's their real impact on our lives. We've understood why we are in such a position, why the governments did what they did in terms of printing money, what their motives were, and why this was an expected outcome of what we've seen in the last 2 years. This is the end to part 1 of our Understanding Inflation podcast. We will be back with part 2 next week, where we will be going over some of the often used terminology that we hear these days, such as the Fed, interest rate hikes, who Jerome Powell is, what impact this has on all of our lives once again, and what we can do to combat inflation. Please join us once again next week, and we love talking to you today. Thank you. Please share this podcast, leave your reviews, your comments to support us on our journey. We are so passionate about making your lives more abundant with this information.
So with that, we bring this episode of our financial adventure to an end. Please follow us on all social media platforms at Fantastic Females.